Um, First, let me just thank everyone for coming out and joining this event today. I'm really happy that we have a good attendance. I really want to welcome everyone here. There's a couple of reasons that I'm unusually pleased to introduce Christopher Goscha, who, as the flyer says, is a professor in the history department at the University of Quebec in Montreal. One reason is that I've known Chris for, I think, exactly 30 years, having first met him in the archives in Aix-en-Provence in 1993. So, you know, there's a kind of special pleasure in seeing an old comrade and friend after all these years and having an opportunity to hear what he's up to. But a second reason that I'm really happy to do this event is that, as many of you know, I'm primarily a historian of Vietnam, and Chris is the historian of Vietnam that I most admire. My admiration for him is based on a couple of things. One is his sort of extraordinary level of productivity, just something that far surpasses that of, you know, basically every other historian in our field. But in addition to Chris's, really impressive quantity of work, I think more importantly is the consistently high quality of his scholarship. Everything Chris writes is exhaustively researched, clearly argued, based on a massive trove of vernacular language sources, and addresses, I think, big, thorny, controversial questions in the field. And I think this is also the case, this is obviously the case with this most recent book, The Road to Dien Bien Phu, that he's going to be talking about today. While this book asks and answers many new and interesting questions about the First Indochina War, it also returns again and again in a kind of relentless way to what I think, you know, is clearly the single most important question related to this topic, namely, how do we explain the dramatic outcome of this war? Why did the winners win? Why did the losers lose? And how do we understand this sort of fundamental end result of this important conflict? I think with this book from Chris, a book that he's been working on and off, I think, for probably half of his career, maybe, I think we finally have, or we have now sort of the most ambitious and persuasive effort to answer this question. And his talk today is going to be a kind of brief introduction to this book. And so you'll get a taste of what his answer is. But I think the complexity and the richness of his answer is such that he won't be able to do it full justice here. And I really hope that folks will go out and buy a copy. So with that brief introduction behind me, let me now turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Peter, for that very kind introduction. Thank you, Sarah, for helping to organize this event with Peter. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm very honored to be able to be here to present a little bit of my book here that I'm just going to bring up on the screen. Whoops. That just came out a few weeks ago, The Road to Dien Bien Phu, a history of the first war for Vietnam, what I call the first Indochina War between 1945 and 1954. Peter is right. I have been working on this book for the last 15 to 20 years in one way or the other. I started to do so in the form of articles. I gave it a stab in a book I wrote in French in 2011. I was never quite satisfied, and it's only been, having continued to work on this since since the French version came out in 2011, but I've really transformed that French version, which was called A State Born of War. I think I've turned it into something different. here in this English language version, which you see in front of you, which was published by Princeton. And I can't do everything as Peter said. There's a lot in the book. It's very detailed, you know, a product of all this work I've done. But I would like to maybe just attack kind of one of the key issues inside the book that I try to address. And you can see here that I'm going to talk about the road to Dien Bien Phu in my talk this evening with you. But I'd like to present maybe a different history of an epic victory. And maybe before I kind of lay out my argument, I just thought for those of you, maybe, I know most of you probably know Dien Bien Phu, you've heard of it, and maybe you've studied it quite, you know, in detail, but perhaps there's some who haven't. But this is an epic victory. This is a historic victory here. This is the 7th of May, 1954. You have the People's Army of Vietnam, the soldiers who have vanquished the French fortress of about 10 to 12,000 French and imperial soldiers who were defending the valley of Dien Bien Phu. I'll show you on a map after. And they raised the flag of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Now, my book really is focused on the making of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the making of this historic victory here at Dien Bien Phu. So I'm sure you've seen this photo. It's a Vietnamese photo from the time. You can see here, you know, that this has been a very serious battle that's been going on for 56, 57 days. For those of you who don't know where Dien Bien Phu is, it's in the northwestern part of Vietnam, which you can see on the right hand here. It was a siege battle that lasted from the 13th of March to the 7th of May. Preparations began actually, say in October, but certainly from November of 1953, and they're going to go all the way through to the accord of the ceasefire agreement at Geneva that was signed in July of 1954. If you look at the map on the right, on the left-hand side, sorry, you can see that you have Vietnam in its S form. You have Laos on the right. On the left-hand side, you have Cambodia as well. The darker, excuse me, the darker kind of brown there, that's kind of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam as it emerged from 1945-46. And then when you get to 1950, the war changes, and that's something I'm going to deal with in my talk today. And you do get a territorial expansion of this kind of dark red that goes to that lighter brown there. But you can see here that you have a state which is I would say concentrated in the upper half of Vietnam, including that kind of lower central Vietnam, and it's certainly in the northwestern part where the Battle of Dien Bien Phu is going to take place. If you look at this photo here, again, it's a famous photo. It shows the People's Army of Vietnam attacking in one of the 3 waves that occurred in April and early May of 1954. I think you can see here that we're not dealing with guerrilla warfare. This is, you know, this is a conventional battle that occurs, and this is what makes it so interesting: is how did the Vietnamese pull this off? Not only how did they organize a professional army, but how did they defeat the colonizer? How did the colonized defeat a major Western, you know, the colonizer army that you see here? So this is attack. You can see the artillery smoke blowing up as they attack the French on the other side. And here's the French on the other side. We're in early May of 1954. And so you have, you know, some French soldiers, Vietnamese soldiers, North African soldiers, if I can put it that way, who are in the trenches. So you can see, again, this is not guerrilla warfare. This is something that comes straight out of World War I, if you like, because artillery being fired by both sides is forcing men into the ground, as you can see it here. And the Vietnamese, they had built their trenches around the French fortress in which you are right here in this photo here. So this is another important photo you might want to keep in mind, just as by way of introduction, is that this Battle of Dien Bien Phu that lasted for 56 days, it's not only a conventional battle, but it's a siege battle. So the Vietnamese are surrounding the French, attacking them with artillery, and they're going over the top. They're leaving the trenches in order to attack, and they're being fired upon, obviously, by the soldiers whom you can see here. This is cleaned up, but this is what I call kind of Dien Bien Phu entrenched, if I can say it that way. This is after the battle. It's sometime in July or August of 1954, but it's just to give you an idea here that this looks a lot more like Verdun, something straight out of kind of the Western Front in France during the World War I, rather than a war of decolonization or some side of a guerrilla war. So my point in kind of starting this way is just to remind you that this is a unique battle that's going on here. in the northwestern part of Vietnam, as you can see in the map on the right-hand side here. Excuse me, you can see that Dien Bien Phu is near Laos, it's in the highlands, and it's not too far from the Chinese border in the south. I'll come back to that in a moment, but just keep in mind kind of these pictures and this type of war that you see here. It was an epic victory. There's no taking that away from the Vietnamese. This was the colonizers who defeated this was the colonizers who defeated the colonizers, the Western colonizers, in set piece battle, in a siege battle, in a conventional battle. So this hit the front pages across the world. Obviously in France on the right and the left, in the center with Le Monde, it was obviously a huge news. It was on the front page of the New York Times as well. But I draw your attention to the L'École d'Oran. Oran, of course, is a city in Algeria, and you can see that the settler community, this is a French settler paper that you have here, the École d'Oran, they're closely following this for reasons which I think we can easily understand what's going on here. Now, what's interesting is that they weren't the only ones who were following the fall of Dien Bien Phu and what was going on in Indochina with the Geneva ceasefire that was signed, a few months or 2 months after Dien Bien Phu. So the settlers were following, but so were the National Liberation Front in Algeria, the Front de Libération Nationale, people like Ferhat Abbas, who would become the first president of an independent Algerian republic in 1962. He referred to Dien Bien Phu as the Valmy, which was the French victory over the Prussians in 1792. He saw in this the affirmation of a nation in arms, the rise of nationalism, which allowed the colonized to defeat the colonizer. So that's one Algerian nationalist, a very important one, Ferhat Abbas, for those of you who know Algerian history, who was following this just like the French settlers were. But another even more famous is the Franz Fanon from Martinique. And of course, you know him for The Wretched of the Earth, Les Damnés de la Terre, which was published in 1961. I have to be honest with you, this paragraph that comes straight out of his book is really what got me rethinking the English language version of my book, this kind of radically new version of the book, The Road to Dien Bien Phu, because it struck me that Fanon really was onto something. I'm not going to read this passage, which I think you can read quite easily yourselves, but it's the part that are underlined that really struck me when I started reworking this book from around 2012, 2013. What must be done to bring about another Dien Bien Phu? How can we manage it? Not a single colonized individual could ever again doubt the possibility of a Dien Bien Phu, is what Fanon writes. The only problem, and this is what really struck me, was how best to use the forces at their disposal, how to organize them, and when to bring them into action. And as you probably know, Franz Fanon was really fascinated by the idea of revolutionary violence. And I think it's easy to understand why he and so many others were following what was going on in Dien Bien Phu. But what makes Fanon's reflection for me so interesting is he wanted the recipe. He really wanted to know how the Vietnamese could do this. So French settlers, let's just say the National Liberation Front in Algeria were following what was going on. Others in the decolonizing world were also following what was going on. But what makes, again, I'm repeating myself, but what makes Fanon's reflection so interesting is he asked the key question, which is at the heart of my book, is how did they do it? So I'm going to present here in this talk for about the next 30 minutes, a different road to Dien Bien Phu. I'm going to try to answer Fanon's question. I'm going to argue that it is a victory like none other in the history of decolonization. That is true, but I think the question that's key here, and it's kind of what runs through my book as well, is I want to try to explain how the Vietnamese communists did it. What did they do to make it happen? And I think to answer Fanon's question, we have to return to the past is what I want to do with you. So this is not going to be a battle history of Dien Bien Phu. It's not going to be a military history of the battles between 1950 and 1954, the big conventional battles. It's going to be a reflection on what kind of state did the Vietnamese communists put together? What type of techniques did they use? What was the recipe they developed in order to build this state which was capable of bringing down the French in conventional battle in Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And my argument is that they do this in a time of war. They do it because of war, and they do it in order to mobilize, in order to bring this victory to fruition. So that's a little bit what I'm going to try to explain in the next 30 minutes. Now, before I do that, I didn't quite know when I was preparing my talk for this evening, if everybody was kind of knew Vietnam and the Indochina War that well or not. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to go back a little bit rapidly to the French colonial period, and then come back quickly to the French Indochina War between 1945 and 1954. So just quickly, let's just go back to the 19th century here. And basically, the French arrive in Southeast Asia, trying to get to the Chinese market, as you know, like the British and others had been trying to do since the 15th century. Basically, the French are going to colonize Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia in two periods. The first starts with the Second Empire, Napoleon III. The second is the Third Republic with people like Jules Ferry. As you know, they will start in the South in the 1850s. There'll be a pause in the 1870s, and then they'll really go at it in the 1880s. Basically, they take Southern Vietnam, they take Cambodia, then they move into the center and the north, and they add Laos at the end, at the turn of the 20th century. They do create this colonial state, which we call Indochina, which no longer has Vietnam. Vietnam is divided, and it has these 5 component parts. So Tonkin in the north, Annam, Cochinchina in the south, Cambodia, and Laos. So you do have a French colonial state, which takes form in the late 1850s, and which will last until the Second World War, when, as you will see in just a moment, the Japanese will bring it down, and that changes everything. So that's just kind of one point on the historical context that I just want to bring to your attention here. The second is we have to say something about the man that you see here. Now, there were Vietnamese who worked with the French. They believed French promises that they would work with the Vietnamese to develop Indochina, to develop Vietnam. They would move down the road to eventual independence. The man that you see here, Ho Chi Minh, very, very famous person. I won't go into detail. He was born in the early 1890s, if you like. He has one foot kind of in the Sino-Vietnamese world. He has another foot in this new French colonial world. He's kind of an intergenerational person between those who were opposed, anti-colonialists who wanted to run the French out and put the monarchy back in, and a new generation that will take up a more radical road to remaking Vietnam and to trying to deal with the French here. But what's interesting about Ho Chi Minh is that he started off as a reformist. He'll leave Vietnam in 1911. He will go to Europe. He will go to France. He will go to Great Britain. He'll cross the Atlantic. He will go to the United States. He will be there in France during World War I. And coming out of World War I, he will be disappointed by the French and by the French failure to reform, to take Vietnamese reformist aspirations seriously. And he will then shift into a new mode. I think he was always a nationalist, but he will move away from cooperation with the French to a much more radical road, a nationalist road, and a revolutionary one. So after World War I, as you know, he will discover socialism, communism, republicanism as well, but he is going to be attracted by socialism and communism. So if you look on the far right-hand side, he's in France here. He's involved in French left political circles. He's making this sign of leftward journey, if you like. If you look at the middle photo on the second from my left, your left as well, he will then leave France in 1923. He will go to the Soviet Union. He will become a communist, if I can put it that way. He will join the Comintern, the internationalist communist movement set up by Lenin, which will exist until the Second World War. So you see him here with Soviet comrades, if you like, in that photo. He will go back to Vietnam within this kind of Soviet Chinese corridor, if you like, that takes form from the 1920s. The Chinese Communist Party comes to life in the early 1920s in Shanghai. And within that kind of that corridor and within kind of a maritime communist movement, Ho Chi Minh will create the Vietnamese Communist Party, which is redubbed the Indo-Chinese Communist Party in 1930 in Hong Kong, in another port city. So he's very much, and this is kind of what I want to just underscore here, he's very much a globetrotter. He becomes a revolutionary globetrotter. We can argue about how important he was or not, but he's definitely a key player in the making of Vietnamese communism. So he's considered, and I think rightly so, as the founding father of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party in 1930. I'm not going to go into details here, but what's interesting, he continues to move around. He's not going to go back to Vietnam until the early 1940s with the Second World War. He'll go back to the Soviet Union. He'll come back to China. And if you look at the photo here, he's with the General Zhu, who's a very important member of the Maoist Club in Yan'an in the late 1930s during the Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 1945. Ho Chi Minh will work with him, working on the peasant question, working on mobilization questions. He will master Chinese quite effectively. He is very much trusted by the Chinese as much as I think he's trusted by the Soviets. So I guess this kind of second point of kind of historical context here is very important for me because I'm trying to show that Ho Chi Minh in particular, and he wasn't the other one, but I'm only going to deal with him because I only have, maybe 25 minutes left, but he's moving within this kind of Eurasian communist arc. He will study in Moscow, he will study in Yan'an, he will work with the Chinese, he will teach Chinese cadres as well. And this was all considered at the time quite normal. No one's thinking about a Sino-Soviet rupture right now. No one's thinking about a Sino-Vietnamese rupture right now. This is a very different arc I'm talking about right here. So Ho Chi Minh is important because he is one of those who will import into Vietnam later on during the Indochina War, a number of techniques, a number of recipes, a number of things which the Vietnamese communists will use to transform their state in revolutionary ways, in ways which will allow them to build up this force that Fanon was talking about, Franz Fanon was talking about, and which will allow them to bring down the French in conventional battle at Dien Bien Phu. So I would ask you to keep that in mind, this kind of Eurasian arc that runs from the Soviet Union all the way to northern Vietnam to the border. So French Indochina operates despite the opposition from the communists who also moved their bases into and inside of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh will continue to circulate on the outside. Things change, of course, and I just have to come to my third point of historical context here. It's the emergence of another empire. It's the Japanese Empire. I won't go into the details here, but Japan becomes an empire with the Meiji Revolution in 1868, and slowly but surely it will expand from the 1870s all the way to its demise in 1945. Now, the point that is absolutely key for us here is that in 1937, the Japanese will invade China. That starts the Second World War, I would say, in the Far East, without the war started in Western Europe yet. That will come in 1939, as you know. But the Sino-Japanese War, kind of the first chapter of the Second World War, occurs in East Asia. And this is very important. Ho Chi Minh is deeply involved in this. He's in Yan'an in the late 1930s, and that's when he is working with the Chinese, working with Mao Zedong, working with Zhou Enlai and others to build up the Chinese Revolution, build up the Chinese military force, and eventually transfer to Vietnam in order to do something similar at the end of this Eurasian arc I'm talking about. Now, the Japanese Empire will accelerate, as you well know, in 1941 when the Japanese attack Hawaii to the east, and then they move rapidly to the south into Southeast Asia, where they will overthrow the Americans in the Philippines, the Dutch in Indonesia, the British, of course, in Burma and Malaysia and Singapore. And they will also move into Indochina from 1940, and they will stay there until the end of the war. So here you have just a few photos here. You have, excuse me, I'm just going to get a quick sip of. You have the outbreak of the Asian chapter of the Second World War in 1937. You have the fall of France, which is very important for us, in 1940. What happens after that is that the Third Republic is no longer there. It's replaced by the Vichy regime which collaborates with the Germans, then the Germans who eventually collaborate with the Japanese in the form of the Axis, which explains why the Japanese in 1940 move into Indochina, but they do not overthrow the French, not right away, because they are considered to be kind of a quasi-ally, even if it's pretty complicated. So you have the Japanese in the middle photo here. Their empire kind of installs itself in Indochina. They're crossing the bridge from the north, I believe, into Langsong here. And you have this kind of Japanese-French Indo-Chinese collaboration, which is going on. That's the case until the end of the war, of World War II. So as you know, in 1939, World War II, the European chapter begins in the West when the Germans invade Poland. France falls, as I just said. The war goes on. What's important is that in 1944, the Allies liberate France. And at that moment, the Japanese are worried about what's going to happen in Indochina with Charles de Gaulle now in power in France. He's going to turn on the Japanese, and the Japanese were right. And so they overthrow the French in Indochina. So it's the end of Indochina, that Indo-Chinese state about which I spoke a moment ago, and it falls in March of 1945. The other thing, fourth point here on historical context, is that this change that is brought about in the balance of power across the world, but in particular in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Vietnam, is very much on Ho Chi Minh's mind. He moves to the border. He is an astute student of international relations, of the war. He has a radio. He's following all of this. So he will cross the border, return to Vietnam for the first time since the early 1910s. And he's going to create a nationalist front, as the Chinese communists had done before him in the 1920s. So a nationalist front. He creates this with someone like Vo Nguyen Giap, you see here. It's created by the Communist Party. So you have this core communist group. You can see them on the right-hand side, 4 key members. I'm not going to read their names. You know most of them. There's others as well. And they create the embryo, the kind of the start of an army. It's a guerrilla army. So you have Vo Nguyen Giap. This is a photo. I'm sure you've seen it before. It's the creation of the Liberation Army in 1944, as everybody realizes that the war, the Second World War, is going to end. The French have been are overthrown in early 1945, and this creates the possibility for Ho Chi Minh to take power with the Viet Minh. That will occur when the Allies finally defeat the Japanese in August, early August of 1945. So that's the historical context here. I'm sorry for those of you who know it really well. But I think the thing to really keep in mind is Ho Chi Minh, we have to, that he's very much involved in this arc, this Sino-Soviet arc that is now moving into northern Vietnam. So now let's go to the Indochina War, and let's take it up in 2 parts, if you don't mind. And the part I really want to get to is the second half of 1950-54. I deal quite a bit in my book with the 1945 to 1950 period. I can't do it here for reasons of time, but I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. I think what's important about this post-August 1945, post-Second World War period is 2 things in terms of what interests here about the outbreak of the First Indochina War. 2 states are born of the Second World War. You have the first one here. It's the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. On the left, Ho Chi Minh announces on the 2nd of September 1945 the creation of this new Vietnamese state that is put back on the map, if you like. Yes, the communists, Ho Chi Minh is a communist. There is a core group which is trying to run the show, not without difficulty, because there's not a lot of communists. They create a coalition government in collaboration with all sorts of non-communists, some of whom you can see here in the middle, with Ho Chi Minh being the president of a provisional government at this time. And on the far right-hand side, there's a contesting of sovereignties now between the new nation state run by Ho Chi Minh and the French imperial state, the second state born of the Second World War, about which I'll talk right after, which is represented on this stamp. So you have Vietnamese independence, freedom, and happiness on this postal stamp, and it's plastered onto the top of a pre-existing stamp that the Vietnamese used because they didn't have time to print their own stamps. I do talk about these questions of contesting sovereignty in my book a little bit more. I have some, I talk about the importance of the battle of the stamps, if you like, but I'm not going to be able to do that here. The second state that's born, the second republic that is born, it's what will become quickly the Fourth Republic, led by Charles de Gaulle first, from 1945 until 1946, when it becomes the Fourth Republic, and then it's led by a variety of different political groups. But regardless of whether it's on the right or the left of the French political spectrum, what is interesting is that this Fourth Republic, this new republic, despite what it says, remains an empire state, and it remains determined to carry on as an empire state. So there's very much continuity in the French imperial state between what existed before and what exists after. And here you have Charles de Gaulle, who will send his army back to Vietnam. I'll talk about that right after this, in order to recuperate it and to reincorporate it, as you can see in this propaganda poster here, into the wider French imperial state. So you can see here what's going on. On the lower right-hand corner, you have Ho Chi Minh in discussions with Charles de Gaulle's main military men, the General Leclerc, Philippe Leclerc, and Jean Saint-Denis, whom you can see here. I'm not going to go into the details. Yes, there were negotiations, but they were not reconcilable. We can go into all sorts of details in the question and answer if you want, but I don't think we need to do it here. In my opinion, war was inevitable. It could not be avoided. So in 1945, war breaks out in the South. There's an attempt to negotiate it. Because the Chinese were in the north, they had occupied Indochina at the end of the war in the name of the Allies. They pull out, war breaks out. War breaks out because you have two irreconcilable conceptions of the future of Vietnam, one being a part of the French nation state, an imperial state, and one being a part of a new nation state, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. I would like to emphasize here, though, that this was a colonial conflict at the beginning. Had Ho Chi Minh, I don't know, how can I put this? Had Ho Chi Minh been Farah Tabas or Franz Fanon, had Ho Chi Minh been Ngo Dinh Diem, who is the anti-communist nationalist who would lead the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam later, if you like, Charles de Gaulle would have attacked him nonetheless, and the war would have broken out. I know that might shock some of you what I just said, but I do believe that quite convincingly, and we can come back to that as well. But colonial war breaks out, and that's what's going to dominate during this first half of the Indochina War between 1945 and 1950. Now, on this period, and I can't spend a lot of time on it because I want to get to kind of the 50-54 in order to explain the change in the state, you have a guerrilla state. You have a state of war which no longer controls, as it briefly did, Hanoi, Hue, Saigon, because the French had been defeated and the Japanese had been defeated, and there was this kind of vacuum of power. They have to leave the cities. They go into the countryside, as you saw on that map that I showed you at the beginning, and they'll set up kind of an archipelago state, is what I call it in my book, a series of islands. And the biggest islands are in the north and in the northwest. A second series of big islands are in central Vietnam, just south of Hanoi, and in lower central Vietnam. And much, much smaller islands are in the Mekong Delta. But it is important to note that a state continued to exist. So you have Ho Chi Minh typing away on his typewriter. You have a bureaucracy that does function, hooked together by radios, hooked together by stamps as well, hooked together by all sorts of things that I investigate in the book. You have an economy which is shattered, I agree, but which functions nonetheless. And the Vietnamese will have their own money, as weak as it was, but there was a real desire, and I think the Vietnamese communists at the core of this kind of coalition state, it wasn't all communist yet, they are very good at keeping the state alive, you know. So that's, I think, a first point that we might consider about this first chapter of the Indochina War between 45 and 54. You have a state of war, but it operates kind of in an archipelago island formation. You have a army, which was created in 1944 as a liberation army. In 1946, it will become the National Army. That's what it was called, not to be confused with the Republic of Vietnam's National Army or the Associated States of Vietnam's army later on. But what's interesting here is that it will operate in guerrilla fashion. It doesn't have artillery. It doesn't have heavy weapons. It is not a professional army. It doesn't have divisions. It doesn't have regiments. It may have a battalion or two, but not much more than that. And here you have a famous citation from Ho Chi Minh. He was talking to an American reporter in Paris as the French and the Vietnamese slid towards war, and he explained why the Vietnamese would win. And of course, he describes Vietnam, he describes this state of war I just told you about as something of a tiger which would attack the big French modern army, which is an elephant. He compared it to an elephant. It would attack indirectly. It would attack at night. It would wear down the French. It would wear down the French political class so that eventually they would have to concede and grant Vietnam its independence. The other thing you can see in this citation, which I think a lot of historians, a lot of journalists, a lot of people who are familiar with the Indochina War, they like this citation, is that again, it's like Franz Fanon said in Ferhat Abbas, it's the nation in arms. So the Vietnamese will win because they have nationalism on their side. As you'll see as I go along, I don't deny the power of nationalism, but I don't think that the tiger versus the elephant or the nation in arms and nationalism is sufficient to explain how the Vietnamese were able to bring down the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. So again, a state of war in an archipelago pattern, running an economy, running an army, but it is a guerrilla army. And this is something very similar to what's going on in the Indonesian-Dutch War, something very similar. That's what's going on, of course, in the French-Algerian War and in many other wars about which you know that existed before and since the French Indochina War. Now, I want to get to the second chapter of the Indochina War. It's the internationalization of the Indochina War. It's the Chinese Communist victory of 1949. So Ho Chi Minh's ally, Mao Zedong, whom you see this photo is from the 1960s. I can't find a photo from 1950, but nonetheless, this does capture nicely this special relationship between the Chinese and the Vietnamese communists at this time, which has existed since the 1920s within this arc I've been talking about. And it is run by Ho Chi Minh and others, but Ho is most definitely a part of it. He's a nationalist, but he is also an internationalist communist, and he's quite familiar with what's been going on since the 1920s in Moscow and in Yan'an and in elsewhere in revolutionary Asia. So what happens here is the Chinese come to power in 49. They will support the Chinese, their allies, their communist allies in Korea, Kim Il-sung, and Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. They will do this diplomatically, they will do this militarily, and they will do this politically. Of course, when the Chinese come to power and when they throw their weight behind the Vietnamese, and in particular, when the Korean War breaks out in June of 1950, this shifts the Cold War massively towards East Asia from the western side of Eurasia. And of course, the Americans enter into the picture. They support the French. They support the state which the French create, the Associated State of Vietnam, led by Bao Dai, in order to contain what they perceive to be the Sino-Soviet Vietnamese communist threat to Asia. So you have the whole domino theory here. I won't get into that. I think all of you are quite familiar with it. But what we do have here is an internationalization of the war. And this is something which Ho Chi Minh welcomed. He welcomed it because this allowed him to change the nature of his state. This allowed him to change the nature of his army. And this allowed Ho Chi Minh and his communist allies to change the nature of the war they would fight from 1950 to 1954, and I would say all the way to 1975, if you like. So I want to focus here on the how. I want to focus here on the transformation, the creation of a state which rose, if you like, from the guerrilla archipelago, which rose. It's the rise of what I call the single party communist state. It was born of war, it was generated by war, and that's what I want to get into now, is how did Ho Chi Minh transform the state? First thing is, the Chinese helped him do it. It was, if I can be a little bit provocative, a Sino-Vietnamese process. That shouldn't surprise us. It might surprise us in a post-1979 Sino Soviet Sino-Vietnamese rupture type of thing, if you like. But at the time, if you look at it coming out of that Eurasian arc I was talking about, they knew each other. I'm not going to give you the names of everyone here, but the man you see on the left, obviously Ho Chi Minh, they knew each other from the late 1920s in southern China. Ho Chi Minh spoke Chinese well. He read Chinese well. He had worked with these Chinese. Mao sent these people because he knew that Ho had worked with them. Ho asked for many of them. So you have the arrival of a Chinese military and a Chinese political advisory delegations, two of them in particular. They numbered around 200 advisors in all, and they will be there from 1950 to 1954. What will they do? Well, they will provide diplomatic support. The Chinese recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in January 1950. They will provide military support. I'll get to that in just a moment. They will provide military training to the Vietnamese troops, to Vietnamese officers as well, inside Vietnam and within China itself. And they will provide also political models, recipes for creating a single party communist state and bringing it up, raising it up from the guerrilla archipelago as the Chinese had done themselves during the Sino-Japanese War and all the way into 1949 until they took power as well. Last thing they would do, they provide economic models, communist models that come from the Soviet Union, that come from China, that they had used, and they will help Ho and his others to apply them to transform the Vietnamese state. So let me get to this let me get to two revolutions. It's kind of a list, sorry to do this, but at least I can get that out there in the remaining time that I have, maybe 10 or 15 minutes. So this Chinese group working with the Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh in particular, are going to implement a military revolution. Chinese military aid, just as the NATO aid to Ukraine is key, the Chinese, a little bit of Soviet aid was absolutely essential to the Vietnamese ability to transform their army. Artillery, anti-aircraft guns, machine guns, mines. Did they have tanks? No. But they had heavy weapons that were not available to the National Liberation Front in Algeria or the Indonesian Republicans fighting the Dutch, for example. Second thing, the Chinese helped the Vietnamese create the People's Army of Vietnam, which came to life in 1950, not before, but in 1950. By 1954, it would have 200,000 men. Third thing, related to the second, sorry, the numbers are off here a little bit. It's a professional divisional army. The People's Army of Vietnam consists of 7 divisions, including an artillery and an anti-aircraft division, or batteries, if you like. No such thing ever existed in the National Liberation Front in Algeria or in Indonesia. I am not denigrating what they did. They didn't have access to this big rear front that the Chinese provided to the Vietnamese. Fourth factor, mass mobilization is decreed just like the Ukrainians did it. Mass mobilization is the draft. Guerrilla armies, they rely on local villages and their young boys, if you like, to join them. Maybe they'll be forced, if you like. This is, I'm sorry, this is a mass mobilization of all the population, men and women, young and old, if you like, here. That also happened in Ukraine a few months ago. Military conscription was imposed on all men between 18 and I believe, I can't quite remember the age of 18 and 60 or 18 and 50. But you have the introduction of the draft. So nation in arms, nationalism is very important. I would never underestimate that. But you also have the state now, which is mobilizing, which is going down to search, to look for people, to mobilize them in order to fight this new type of war, in order to man this new type of professional divisional army that you have here. 6 point. 8 conventional battles will occur between 1950 and 54. It happens very fast. It happens because the Vietnamese have this aid from China. You have the Battle of Cao Bang, which the Vietnamese win. There will be a series of other battles, many of which they will not win. And then we get to the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, which they will win. Last point here, which is important, is that although this was although this was an archipelago type state, that existed between 45 and 50. I can't get into details here, but in my book, I try to show that it was a functioning state, a state and an army as well, which was able to take that assistance, take that training, those experiences, and transform it into revolutionary violence, something that Franz Fanon wanted to do. So my point here is, how are they doing this? First, it's a military revolution. Second, how? What did they do? I think there's a revolution, excuse me, in statecraft. It's this idea of creating a single party state, which with the help of the Chinese, the Vietnamese communists will lift up and they will impose upon the territories that they control, in particular in the north and in the center. So I give you some examples here. This is the recipe that's coming from this corridor. This is the recipe that's coming from what Ho Chi Minh and others in his party had discovered in the Soviet Union and China, and on their own as well. There's no doubt about it. But the party from 1950 will expand its control over the state with Chinese assistance, advice, models. You have increased party control over the Nationalist Front. They will actually remake the Nationalist Front in 1950. Increased control over mass associations, increased party control over the police and the army. That's our first point. It's very important. I can come back to it in the Q&A if you want. Second point, borrowed from the Soviets and the Maoists in particular, it's rectification. It's rectification of the party, the army, the police. It's the creation of a loyal communist cadre bureaucratic class, which the party can control. And it can also purge non-communists who don't want to go along with the line. Third point is the line. Everybody talks about the line, in particular the Chinese and the Vietnamese, this correct party line. Ho will borrow this from what he saw in Yan'an and elsewhere. The idea is to create a homogeneous ideological control over intellectuals, over civilians, or bureaucrats in the state, in the police service, and all the different branches of the government. They don't do it overnight, but they start to do it slowly but surely from 1950. Fourth point, which is important, and this is borrowed in particular from the Chinese. You don't need me to tell you this. Vietnam, like China, not quite like the Soviet Union, is a much more rural, peasant-based society at the time. And the idea is to mobilize the peasant class for the army, mobilize the peasant class for the staffing of the state as well, the police, all sorts of different things, in order to prepare for this new type of war. But at the same time, land reform allows them to overturn the rule hierarchy, the feudalist class, if you will, the landowners, in order to put the party's people in control. So this fourth thing here, which is borrowed from the Chinese, this is a way of gaining increased control over the society and over the peasant class, the peasant society, the majority of the population in particular. Others whom you know, Alex and others have worked on this. Olga has worked on this as well. We can talk about that. But these are important parts of this recipe that I'm talking about. These are important parts of my answer, if you like, to Franz Fanon, is that you are dealing with something very different in Vietnam, in China, and I would say in North Korea. Another one is this patriotic emulation campaigns. I'll come back to that in a second, but the idea is to create a new class of heroes for the peasant class, for women, for bureaucrats, for just about everybody. You kind of elevate these great examples that you can use, and you promote them through closely monitored, closely organized meetings at the ground level, at the village level, as low as you can go, in order to mobilize and to bring people over to your side. Creation of the cult of personality that had already been in motion, as others have shown, but quite clearly it accelerated during the second half, because it was part of this way of establishing ideological homogeneity, if I can put it that way, and increased party control. It was very important for mass mobilization. So those are important things. I would just skip maybe to the number 8 here. And this is something that hasn't been studied. I dedicate 2 chapters to it. You have something similar that it occurs in China during the war against the Japanese. It certainly occurs during the Russian Civil War, when the Bolsheviks tried to control food, and they used that need for food to nourish the cities as a way of gaining increased party control over the state. And you see something very, very similar happening during the second half of the Indochina War, because the party, the Vietnamese Communist Party, has to find food in order to feed these 7 divisions. An army that doesn't eat cannot fight. And they use that, as the Chinese had and as the Soviets or the Russians had before, in a time of war communism, in order to increase the party's control. So I'm arguing now that this raising up of the single party communist state from war, it's a form of war communism that's applied in a time of decolonization, the Chinese communists fighting the Japanese and the Vietnamese communists fighting the French. So 2 revolutions, a military revolution and a state revolution, and these 2 things go hand in hand in the sense that the party is increasing its hold over both. Don't forget that my idea in kind of laying this all out in front of you is still to respond to that question of Franz Fanon at the beginning. How the heck did you guys do this? So here's some examples that you have here. The cult of personality, Ho Chi Minh's birthday, whether Ho was born on the 19th of May, it doesn't matter. What matters here is how his birthday was used as a mobilizing technique to rally people around the cause, around the man who embodies the nation, sure, but who also embodies this single party communist state that he helped create with his colleagues and with the Chinese as well. On the right-hand side, you have the Congress, very important in 1952, as the war was not going so well, these conventional battles. They are really going hell-bent for leather to find a way to mobilize everyone and everything in something of a total war. And these emulation campaigns are very important. So in the front row, you have Chen Dai-Nghia, on the right-hand side, who is a scientist and engineer who is elevated as one of these heroes to emulate. Other scientists, other engineers, other bourgeois intellectuals should copy him. You have peasants, you have women, you have everything. So this is a Congress where they get medals. You can see them. They're celebrated by the party, by the state. They represent the patriotic movement, but they also are chosen from 1950 on for their class loyalty as well. Some others, tools that are coming from this Sino-Vietnamese war communist kit that I'm talking about here. Obviously, land reform. The army, the police organize it. Cadres are there. You can see them sitting behind a peasant woman whom they mobilized to denounce a landlord. If he's a landlord or not, we can talk about that later. Many mistakes were made. I think you know that, but it doesn't matter in terms of what I'm saying here. What matters is that this is a process, this is a toolkit, and they're applying it, and Ho Chi Minh's applying it. The idea that Ho Chi Minh didn't believe in this is just untenable. He was involved in this. He was involved in it in China, and he's involved in it here. In other words, what you see here in northern Vietnam in these photos that you have, it's the arc being pushed all the further into the northern part of Indochina. You have a rectification session in the middle photo and at the bottom here. Obviously, you can see Stalin, Mao, and Ho Chi Minh, the cult of personality. And he's instructing cadres who will then be sent out to different parts of the territorial state to increase the party's hold over the state. Here's some more of these emulation campaigns. You can see it here, Tidua. On the right-hand side, lower level, Ho Chi Minh was very much involved in another Congress for the patriotic emulation campaign in 1952. 1952 is a key year. We can come back to that, but I don't think we need to dwell on it here. You have the heroes on the left-hand side here of all kinds who are being celebrated with the hero of the heroes, Ho Chi Minh himself. And so this is carefully choreographed, but this is a process. This is a tool. This is a mechanism that is being used across this larger corridor that I'm talking about. This is my colleague and friend, Benoit de Tréglaudet, who wrote what I think is a really path-breaking book on the emulation campaigns, on the heroes, if you like. And this is a third revolution that I'd like to evoke with you here, if you don't mind. It's a bureaucratic revolution. And it kind of allows you, I think Benoit really sums it up here. This new man, new woman as well, was a cadre, a soldier, a meritorious peasant. What was novel about communism was what it achieved with the methods it used, the recipe, if you allow me to put it my way, a widespread and far-reaching propaganda technique, and an authoritarian policy designed to mobilize the members of a collective behind the exemplary models and these new and virtuous figures. The new man rapidly became a successful idea for a government that was looking to root its political legitimacy among the population. Far from a philosophical abstraction, I think Benoit is right. The new heroic bureaucracy that they constructed from 1950 produced a contingent, a group of men and women capable of reinforcing the structure of the state, and that goes as well for the army. A study of its transformations of the state is a study, and the army is a study of the regime. I think Benoit really puts his finger on something important here. And again, I cite it for you because this is me trying to answer Franz Fanon as well, is that we have something very unique, what I call a type of war communism, a Sino-Vietnamese war communism that is going on here. Now, again, this goes back across this corridor. I won't name all these people, but you have this toolbox, if you like, and it still exists in China and it still exists in Russia today. We can get to that if you want. I'm not a specialist of Russia, but certainly the emulation campaigns, rectification are alive and well in China. I'm quite convinced they're alive and well in Putin's Russia as well. But you have heroes here. Some of them you recognize on the upper, in the left-hand side, it's two Chinese heroes. On the bottom, well, on the far right and lower, these are Soviet heroes before and during World War II. I'm just making the point here is Ho Chi Minh and others, they were well aware of this. This interested them. They wanted access to this toolbox. They were part of the making of it as well in kind of a transnational way. So when I say that maybe this Vietnamese state, this raising of the single party state was a Sino-Vietnamese process, it's not to provoke, it's just that it makes sense. And the Vietnamese are going to take this process to Laos and Cambodia and do much there what the Chinese were helping them to do in Vietnam. We can come back to that later. So here it is. I'm not going to read this. This is kind of, I would say, the core of my argument about war communism. And it's a process. It's a process that started in 1950 for all these reasons I just talked to you about. We can talk about them a little bit more if you want in the Q&A. But the second paragraph is important. Like the Chinese, like the Russian Bolsheviks, the Vietnamese did not wait for the hostilities to end. They could have waited until 1954. They didn't. They used war. They needed war in order to push through the creation of a single party state. This process of war communism generated, and this is kind of where maybe everybody might not agree with me, but it generated during the second half of the conflict what was in effect a slow burning coup d'etat of historic proportions, largely imperceptible to the French, to the Americans, to others on the outside, except perhaps for the Chinese, but from which the Vietnam we now know today first emerged, a communist Vietnam with nationalist characteristics. My argument here and in the book is that war allowed, and this recipe and the Chinese communist support allowed the Vietnamese communists with Ho Chi Minh at the top of that list to create the single party communist state that we know today. They could have waited until 1945. They could have left the coalition government that was created in 1945 in place. They didn't. They took it over. It was, in my opinion, a coup d'etat. So I'll get to the end here, Peter. I know I might not have a lot of time. Maybe if I could have 5 more minutes. And I'm not going to do a military history here. I just want to make the point that between 1950 and 54, they will fight conventional battles without ever giving up the guerrilla warfare as well. In particular, in the deltas, they will continue to do the the guerrilla warfare against the French in the northern delta, Red River, in the southern delta, the Mekong River. In order to, this might surprise you, but in fact, what they were really trying to do the most was to get rice and to get it to the highlands where the People's Army of Vietnam, the divisions were operating. We can come back to that later, but that is something that I try to develop in the book as well, is that the Vietnamese never gave up on the lowlands because they needed them. They needed them for food. But they create an army and they create a state, both of which are capable of fighting conventional warfare. It came at a high price. I can talk about that later if you want. I don't have the time to do it here, but you have on the left here, the attack. That's not guerrilla warfare. That's artillery provided by the Chinese, a little bit by the Soviets, that the Vietnamese are firing to soften up, if I can put it that way, the French, as they go over the top to attack. On the right-hand side, it's a map of northern Indochina with the core communist leadership organizing the battle. This was right before this is in preparation for the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. So I come back to this, and here we are. And so between 1950 and 54, the increasing power, the increasing capacity of the Vietnamese state to create this revolutionary violence about which Franz Fanon was speaking allowed them to increase their territorial hold. It allowed them to connect their islands. It allowed them to consolidate their hold over something of a sickle-shaped Democratic Republic of Vietnam, with the head wrapped from Cao Bang in the north, around the western side of the Red River Delta, all the way down to Zone 5 in lower central Vietnam. The presence of the Vietnamese was not very great in the south in the Mekong Delta, but they were present in what would later become South Vietnam. So if you see my arrow here, that's zone 4 is right here. Zone 5 is here. So when Dien Bien Phu occurred in the northwest, they also attacked in the center here. The Vietnamese communists were in control of a very substantial portion of Vietnam. The Mekong Delta, no, but the Mekong Delta is not all of what would become South Vietnam or the Republic of Vietnam. So you have this amazing battle that took place between late 1953 and May of 1954. What's also interesting, I would like to attract your attention to this, is that it is no accident that the Vietnamese communists, backed by the Chinese, started, and Alex talks about this, started land reform as they started the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Just as Mao Zedong fought the Korean War while implementing massive land reform, in particular in southern Vietnam, places he had taken from the Chinese Nationalist Army, so too did the Vietnamese, following that model, launch a large-scale battle at Dien Bien Phu, not knowing that it would end in May, not knowing what was going to come, but they were thinking that they were going to go maybe for another 2 to 3 years, as the Chinese had done. I hope that's clear. I didn't quite explain that really well. I can come back to it, but conventional war and revolutionary transformation of the state went together, land reform, as it did in China, overthrowing the so-called feudalist class, but also mobilizing the peasants in order that they would be able to fight what might have been a war that could go on until 1956. It didn't in the end, but they did not know that when they started preparations for Dien Bien Phu and for land reform at that time. What they did know is that the two things had to go together. So the tiger becomes something very different. The Vietnamese tiger becomes something of a modern elephant, but it's very different from the modern French elephant and other types of, if you like, professional armies that were fighting. It will fight this battle. It will fight it in the open. Look at that photo. This will never occur in Algeria. It will never occur in Indonesia, nor will it occur in Afghanistan. We could talk about Ukraine if you want. Something similar is happening in Ukraine. Something. I just say only something. The nature of the state is different, but clearly a state in Ukraine exists, which is capable of organizing logistics, organizing a professional army. And I think the Vladimir Putin, like maybe Henri Navarre, badly underestimated the capacity of his enemies to fight a conventional war and not just a guerrilla warfare. My last point, and I'll end on this, is nationalism is very important. It's important in Ukraine. It was important in the French victory at Valmy, the nation in arms. I don't think we should throw nationalism out. I don't think anyone does. But I guess my argument, and I'm working a little bit off of what Richard Overy has said about the Second World War, it can shape outcomes, but it cannot alone explain major battle victories or losses for that matter like Dien Bien Phu. So Ho Chi Minh was indeed a nationalist. I think you can be communist and a nationalist. I think you can be anti-communist and a nationalist as well. But what you cannot do is not take up the fact that Ho Chi Minh was a member of this revolutionary Eurasian corridor about which I'm speaking, which produced this war communism, which is the subject of my book, The Road to Dien Bien Phu, A History of the First War for Vietnam. Thank you very much.
let me just throw out a quick question to get us started while people form questions. So you don't say much in the book, Chris, about historiography. And so I want to begin by asking you a little bit about that. Sort of two questions, I guess. One is just, tell us a little bit about how the historiography of the first Indochina War sort of has evolved over time. But two, and more pointedly, even though you don't talk much about historiography, you hint, based on what you're consistently and repeatedly arguing against, that in the historiography, and this is how you ended your talk, a dominant argument is that nationalism is the main explanatory factor for the DRV's victory. My question to you is, why do you think that argument is so powerful, so durable? Clearly, it's something you see as worth taking on because it's the whipping boy of the book. You end your talk with it. So what explains the persistence and the kind of widespread belief in that argument?
The short answer, Peter, is I don't know. And I know that's a disappointing answer. I think that's not a sufficient answer to what is an important question you're posing. So I'm going to go a little bit further. But I do think that, when it comes to the First Indochina War, I think there's two things. I'm going to just stay put on the First Indochina War, if that's okay for the time being here,
Yep.
and leave the American War, because I think that can be interesting as well. Leave the American War out for the time being here. But I don't think the historiography on the First Indochina War has evolved much beyond Paul Meuse. And Paul Meuse was picked up by Francis Fitzgerald and picked up by a lot of people in the anti-war movement in the US. Paul Meuse, I've written about this before, I don't want to get in it too much, but he's the only one really who tried to explain, in Sociologie d'une guerre, the sociology of the Vietnamese War, he tries to explain what happened. But when you get down to the nitty-gritty, he comes back to nationalism. He comes back to this idea that, Ho Chi Minh replaced the monarchs. He had the mantle of legitimacy that goes way back in this anti-Chinese discourse that he resurrected. And I think he really was the first to do that. And that really, and I'm looking even at kind of folks working on the Indochina War, with the exception of Benoit, that has been the only, that's remained the main explanation. And it was picked up by Francis Fitzgerald, it was picked up by McAllister, it was picked up by, I would say to some extent, by Pierre Bourchieu, Daniel Emery, and even David Marr and others. And that obviously it was radicalized by the war and the anti-war movement. But if we stay on the French Indochina War, and I think this is where I'm less of a problem with nationalism, but it's just like, we can do better on the French Indochina War than Paul Meuse, and we have to do better. So I guess in my book too, I'm throwing a lot of things out there. I do think, Peter, that nationalism should not be thrown out. And I think you agree with me on that. But it cannot alone explain things. And I guess my second point is, you do have in the historiography people like Bernard Fall. Great guy, great stuff. We all know who he is. But there's also kind of a fetish around Bernard Fall and kind of full-on military history. That's fine. Bernard Fall, everyone, I think a lot of people know, I have huge respect for him. But Bernard Fall was also very close to Paul Meuse and that way of thinking. What he did, not all that, but what he did that was different, is that he really zoomed in on military history, on battle history. So I don't know if this makes sense, but it's the poverty of the historiography on the First Indochina War that strikes me, and that we're in something of a time warp. And so much has changed, and I think we can do so much I think we can do better. I think we can do better with new ways of studying war, new ways of studying state building, something like what Benoit did. And he was, he was connected that, but he came at it from the Chinese side and from Chinese studies on Mao, which were much more critical. My last point is I think Mao created such hell, did such terrible things. I don't want to minimize what the Vietnamese did, but the whole great leap forward, we count the number of dead in the millions. You don't need me to tell you more. I think that allowed for people working on China, even kind of, people who were against what the Americans were doing, to say, you know what, we got to talk about what's going on here, what Mao is doing. So those would be my 3 responses to your question, Peter.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Let me quickly pose a question in the that's come in the Zoom, and I'm just going to paraphrase.
Okay.
This question comes from Chris Hulshoff, who I know is a grad student at University of Wisconsin, and he asks. He points out that another major book on the First Indochina War has just come out, basically at the same time as yours, Sean McHale's book.
I agree.
Do you have any comment on the relationship of his argument and his book to yours?
Well, I mean, I'm going to it's not that I'm ducking the question, but Sean and I have just released a podcast where the American Historical Review asked us to comment and to review each other's books. And then we had a face-to-face conversation with each other. And to be really honest, we went into details on that very question that was asked. I do think that you're right to bring up Sean. I should have mentioned him. He has done excellent work. His book is very good. He's definitely moving us in a new direction on the First Indochina War. When I answered your question, I was a little bit more focused on maybe the French side.
Okay.
Is that okay to duck that question there?
Sure, but
Sean's book is really good. I think our work is related. We want to get down to the ground level. We want to explain state and violence and those sorts of things.
People can access that exchange on the AHA website?
That's correct.
Okay.
The podcast is out. I don't know if the reviews have been published yet. I haven't seen Sean's review of my book, and he hasn't seen mine. This is something new they put together.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, another question. This comes from Win, recent Berkeley Ph.D.
All right.
And she says, thank you very much for your presentation. You talked about your book in French, published in 2011. Do the primary sources that you use for Road to Dien Bien Phu differ from the ones you used in that book?
What differs a
French
lot?
book.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I did a lot of new digging, except in one area, which is, I think, very important, and that's economics. I realized that I really missed something big on the economics, financial nature of the archipelago state, and then I missed something really big on food and how the party had to find food and how the party had to, and in trying to find the food, much like the Russian Bolsheviks, they used that endeavor to increase their control over the state down to the lower levels. Obviously, land reform is related to that as well. The other thing, the third thing to answer that really good question is that I really developed some stuff on the French side that I never realized. The French let loose a full-blown economic war on the Vietnamese in order to deny them food. And that meant a blockade from 1950, and in particular, as if by accident, from 1952 to 1954. It also meant bombing, strategic bombing. So what does that mean? That means bombing dikes, bombing irrigation canals, bombing any sorts of kind of industries that might exist. And they bombed livestock on particular in a concerted, organized aim to starve the Vietnamese. And that means civilians, so that they would not support the People's Army of Vietnam or the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Those are the 3 main things I would say to that question.
Okay, thank you. Another question. This is from Vincent Tran, who if it's the same Vincent Tran as a Berkeley undergraduate, recent Berkeley graduate with a BA. Basically, what he asks is, you make a point that 1950 is this
Mm.
big transition, and you point to the entry into Vietnam that year or beginning that year
Mm-hmm.
of these Chinese mobilization techniques, rectification, etc. He asks, what about medicine? Does the military medicine change significantly around 1950?
Yeah, man, that's really good. Now that's related to the question right before, is that's the chapter that I cut because I mean, you're going to say I'm ducking the question. The whole medical question, I just couldn't handle it. I couldn't handle it in the sense that it was beyond my competence kind of medically and dealing with it. And the second thing, I couldn't get a hold of the information that I really wanted. That question is still on my mind. Someone should write a PhD on that. There's something to be done on medicine in the first Indochina War. Any sort of war, you need these sorts of things. I know I'm starting to sound like I'm ducking questions, but I couldn't find enough information, and I didn't go to the archives to do that. I was kind of working off what I did in the first book, and then transforming it and really bringing out my argument. It remains an unknown. It remains an unknown.
Okay. Okay, there's no other questions, but I actually have many questions. But let me just ask one that's short. You have raised.
Peter,
Oh,
I have
go
a
ahead.
lot of chat questions. I don't know if folks know that they're not supposed to go through chat.
Oh, I see. I see. Yeah, I could ask a question in the chat. Let's see.
No, I'm not trying. You go ahead and ask if you want, but I just keep it popping up on my
Yeah,
screen.
let me see if there's
Okay.
any question in the chat that I think is better than my question. Not really. I'll ask this one for the chat. How did the Viet Minh coordinate their attacks? Did they have good quality radios?
Yeah.
Quick one.
Yep. The radio, that was I had the most fun writing that chapter, both for the pre-50 and the post-50. I think the post-50, they got a lot of radio equipment from the Soviets and from the Chinese. Again, what's interesting is that they had a lot of training before 1950, and they knew how to use those, and they used them really, really well. Again, don't forget, Ho Chi Minh also was an accomplished radio operator. He worked with the Chinese Communist Army, working as a radio operator. He worked with the OSS as a radio operator. Ho Chi Minh knew what he was doing. And you can be sure he wasn't the only one either. I keep using him just as kind of a model, but there was others. And they're coming out of the Second World War, and they know how to do it. And so they had the training. So when these radios arrived in large numbers in 1950, and when they had to know how to organize them to run, battalions, regiments, and divisions, they could do it. And they would do it really well as well against the Americans. They also perfected, by the end of the Indochina War, cryptology. So it's quite impressive.
Mm. Okay, thank you. Another question from the chat. I'll just read it. You've presented earlier that Ho Chi Minh was exposed to different types of ideology during his time abroad, i.e. socialism, communism, republicanism, etc. And this is an interesting question. I want to see if you duck it or not.
Okay.
What's your opinion of his decision to go with socialism, communism? Was communism, as a follow-up question, was communism the only way to achieve victory over the French logistically? But I think the first question is one that I actually had as well. Like, during the war, the big question is a normative question. Whereas as a historian, you're kind of asking these analytical questions, but I wonder if you have a view of the normative question. What's your opinion of Ho's decision to go with socialism, communism? Was it worth it? Were the things lost outbalanced by the things gained? I'm curious how you'd approach that question. And that's by someone named Phuc Do. I'm not sure who that is.
So I just want to make sure I understand there. What is my opinion on his decision?
Yes. What is your opinion on his decision to go with socialism, communism? Do you have an opinion on that?
I've never really thought about that. I guess I was always trying to play the historian. I was just trying to understand what he was trying to do. I do think that by making that decision to move into that Eurasian corridor, so to speak, he locked himself in, for better or for worse, into a certain way of doing things, both in terms of generating revolutionary violence, i.e., creating eventually an army and creating a state. Um, I don't know if he ever had doubts about what was, what he was doing, as things got really, really violent during the second half of the Indochina War. Maybe he did, but my understanding is, and I'm relying a little bit on Alex's work as well, and Olivier Tessier's, he, as far as I can tell, he was all in. He was all in until the end of the Indochina War that I cover in the book. And so, the execution of the mother of the resistance, land reform. I mean, we have the post, Sino-Vietnamese break and all that, where we blame it all on the Chinese. But from what I can tell, he was part of that bigger picture. And I don't ever see any sort of evidence that he regretted it. Any sort of like from the pre-1954 period, and not people telling us later on what he thought.
Got it. Okay. This next brilliant question is from my wife, Gum Nguyen, teaches
I expect nothing less.
literature at Berkeley. Really insightful question. There's actually two questions. The first is, you indicate in your talk that 1950 marks the big change. One, military conscription of men between 18 and 50. What happens to those who do not want to join? Were there a large number of men trying to avoid joining the army? What's the evidence on that? That's one question. Second question is about the cult of personality. She asks, do you see similar cult of personality like praise of Ho Chi Minh before 1950? How does the cult, is it emerge in 1950, or is it in 1950 it changes?
Yeah. Again, this is not ducking. We need a book. We need an article on desertion. We need a book. We need an article on the draft, on mobilization. That sort of thing. From what I've seen from both Vietnamese and, of course, the French were following this as well. Not everyone wanted to just join, and that's classic stuff. So you do have people leaving the DRV zones and going into the associated state of Vietnam. But the problem is that in 1951, de Lattre imposes general mobilization, meaning all the population in the associated state of Vietnam, i.e. the French Indochinese Federation, and the draft. So they're caught between a rock and a hard place. So then what you get is richer people, the classic thing, getting their sons and to some extent their daughters out of any sort of labor tasks or out of the army. But in Vietnam, you can see, and that's the argument that I'm kind of making here, is that you kind of got a double conscription. I didn't talk about the associated state of Vietnam, but they may run from one, but they're going straight into the other. So the weight on the Vietnamese peasant class in particular is extraordinary. Is absolutely extraordinary. And this is why I closed the book by saying that the French and the Vietnamese exhausted the population. They absolutely exhausted, and famine was breaking out. I think Ho, one of the main reasons he didn't go to Dien Bien, I think one of the reasons why he signed on to to the Geneva ceasefire accord is that he knew he couldn't push any harder without some sort of resistance popping up. So that's my long answer to when you have these coercive, because that's what a draft is. That's what it was in Valmy. Don't forget that Valmy in 1792, what did the French do in 1793? Lever en masse, the draft. That's what they did. That's what you have to do if you want to create, a modern professional army. You cannot create divisions without forcing young men to be part of them. That's, I mean, to some, at least in a time of war, that usually happens. I'm talking about, Ukraine. I'm talking about, Vietnam. I'm talking about World War II, et cetera. On the cult, it existed before, and then it changes. It's ramped up. It's ramped up in a big way. Ho Chi Minh's birthday is, really advanced. All these things are elaborated upon. They're turned into a science. And I think this is to answer your question. The second question is they really are pushed down to the lower levels of society as far as they can in order to politicize is what it's all about. in order to politicize as many people as they can. Does that mean that everyone's believing in Ho Chi Minh? No. Does that mean they reached everyone? No. But are they trying to do it? Yes. And that's part of this process that I think we have to take seriously.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, we're at 5:30. Do we have a little bit more time or do we need to stop now?
Sure, you can keep going as long as Chris is agreeable.
Sure.
Chris, you up for a couple more questions?
Yeah, sure. Love to.
Okay. So just, this is, I think, a fairly quick one. You mentioned that the archipelago states, this is a question by Jenny Pham. She's a PhD in history here at Berkeley.
Great.
She says, you mentioned that the archipelago states had a form of money. Was this commodity or fiat money?
It's money. They started printing it in, I would say 1946 is the key year. Does that mean that it was accepted by everybody? No. Does that mean that it was worth something? No. As a matter of fact, it wasn't. And I think this is something I try to show in these two economic chapters is that, I mean, what's really fascinating is that the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, they're buying Indo-Chinese piastres because that's the hard currency that they need in order to trade with the French colonial cities, in order to trade with Thailand, if you want, and that sort of thing. So the money exists, but it's weak. It's weak. It's so weak that when we get to 1952, as in China and as in the Soviet Union in the early 1920s, the real money is rice. And the bank that they create based on the Chinese Maoist model is running on rice. And that's the only way that they can protect themselves from inflation in this sort of thing. So it's a vicious circle. The economy, I could have talked about that tonight. I'm maybe, another time, but the economy is absolutely crucial to understanding what's going on here. So money, yes, 1946 till the end of the war, it's pretty worthless.
Okay. There's two more questions here. So let me give you these two, I'll give you one and then after your answer, give you the other, and then I have one concluding question, and so we'll try to wrap it up.
Sounds good.
First is from someone named Ein Mai. It says, the question is, based on your research, do you consider the first land reform successful and that it served its purpose?
In terms of what I discussed this evening with you, no. I don't really think the land reform had the time to get underway to really help out the Vietnamese in terms of like providing more food and providing more recruits for the Vietnamese. I think, and this I argue in the book, is that when they started both preparations for this last battle and preparations for land reform, the two things went together. They were also faced with famine. There was famine breaking out in different parts of Vietnam. They were trying to find ways to get food. But no, I don't think it achieved the goal of providing more recruits or providing more food, because the battle ended up with a win and the war ended in 1954. But when they did it, they thought that it would go on at least until 1956. I think this is what's important. So that the land reform itself was generated by this food problem and generated by the need to really take the conventional war to a new level. Just on that food, the reason, this is another reason why I'm kind of thinking out loud here, land reform didn't really produce more food production, is that people don't know this. We talk about the Chinese importing, guns and all that is very important. But for Dien Bien Phu, the Chinese provided rice. And so did Laos. And this was important. Why? Because at the beginning, the Vietnamese thought they were going to win that battle in January of 1954. And then they changed it. And they said, no, we can't take this right away. It's going to be a long and drawn out battle. The logistics front, the food front, I talk about this in my book, they went nuts. And they went straight to China. They said, we have to have food. And don't forget that in China, they were doing land reform just right across the border. It's a transnational land reform that's going on. It's very interesting. And they didn't have a lot of rice. So did it allow the party to increase control? Yes, to answer that question. Did it allow them to produce more recruits and food? My answer, at least at this point, is no, because the war ended before we got an answer.
Okay, this last question from the chat, it's a little long. I'll just read it and see if it's clear.
Yep,
One of your central arguments is that the party state became more strong and solid during the war. If I'm not mistaken, in your response to the H. Diplo roundtable on your French book, you argue that the strength of the DRV state was uneven. The state apparatus was much weaker in urban areas under French and ASV control.
Mm-hmm.
This suggests that the transformation of the state was more complete in areas under DRV control. Have your impressions of this unevenness changed or not with the new English language book?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it gets back, what I realized in the English language version is that, and I believe this is true in what I said in H. Diplo, I haven't looked at it in a long time, and in the French version as well, is that from 1950, the party with the army, with the police, with the bureaucrats that they had, they were able to increase territorial control. The two things went hand in hand. Obviously, military, they could push out the associated state of Vietnam and the French soldiers in a lot of areas. And that's that map that you saw with the two different colors. I think that still holds. I guess the second thing I would say that I realized in doing the English language version is that it's this sickle shape that emerges. And this you see with the Battle of Cao Bang, and they realized when they got whooped, if I can put it that way, in the Delta, that they could not take the Delta, even though they wanted the food there badly. And so they went around through Hoa Binh. They went south. And what I try to develop in the book is that they linked it. They linked the Northern Island to Zone 4 and Zone 5 in the form of this kind of sickle shape with the head wrapped around the Delta. And what I developed more, I know this might not be what the questioner was looking for, but that sickle shape hooked up with the Delta, with the Red River Delta. And that's where they sent their guerrilla troops into there to get the rice out that they needed, to feed the head of the sickle in some way. And they did the same thing in the handle. So I'm not sure the reader, I'm sorry, that the questioner saw me coming in this direction, but what consolidated was this sickle wrapped around the Red River Delta with the handle jutting all the way, only 150 kilometers north of French Saigon, which means that the Vietnamese communists, they gave up a lot of consolidated territory that they had consolidated in the early 1950s when they signed on to Geneva. And this means, and this maybe is where Sean and I differ, is that the idea that South Vietnam was somehow not affected by this consolidating sickle shape that I'm talking about, I have problems with that. Zone 5 is where Phan Van Dom was from, and he did not want to give this up, and it's easy to understand why. They had a division in Zone 5, so they consolidated, and so I don't think I've changed from what I said before in that H. Diplo and the book, the French book, but I think that I've provided a more sophisticated answer about what went into that consolidation. And again, why it was important for food reasons too.
Got it. Okay. Okay. Last question, Chris. So you hinted at various points in your presentation that you have been thinking about the Ukraine war.
Yeah.
And, I can't help but wonder how your research on this war, which has some obvious parallels, some, obvious differences, but, how does your research on this war shape your thinking about what might happen in this Ukraine-Russia war?
Well, what I think is important is that we can do military history, and a lot of this is military history. The title of the book is The Road to Dien Bien Phu, obviously the history of the First Indochina War. But we have to understand the types of states that are behind. Again, I get back to Franz Fanon. We have to understand the type of states that generated this type of violence. So again, I'm not denigrating the FLN / the Algerian Republic or anyone else for that matter, ISIS or whatever, they might be. But in Ukraine, they were in a situation, as I think many of you know, when the Russians took Crimea, they didn't have an army, they had a professional army, but they were in no position to fight the type of war that they're doing now. So first answer to your question is that they did have NATO behind them. And when Crimea happened, the UK, the US in particular, started providing arms. And they also started providing training, and I mean serious training. But they were dealing, much like the Chinese and the Soviets were with the Vietnamese communists, with a state and with a political and a military class which was able to take that which they gave them and to transform that into serious stuff. And that's where Vladimir, again, like Henri Navarre, made a big mistake. I honestly think he walked in a couple months ago, things they're going to get really bad in Ukraine. We know that. But you're going to see, he walked in thinking that he was going to walk all over them. And that did not happen. Just like the French, that's what the French said before they went into Dien Bien Phu. They wanted that battle. We are going to, it was a very kind of vulgar word that they used. We will break them. It means that we will crush them. Such was their arrogance. And they badly underestimated the state, not nationalism. Again, nationalism's there, but it's this state and the ability to create this army. And again, Fanon is onto something, this revolutionary violence. This is what Fanon would be interested in if he were looking at Ukraine today. It's like, what are they doing? And here are some of the answers that I've tried to provide. So you're going to see, the trenches are already there in Eastern Ukraine, and you're going to see stuff straight out of World War II, because to some extent, that's what the Indochina War is too. It's coming out of World War, it's coming out of this Eurasian arc, but it's also filtered through this brutal Second World War, both in Asia and in Western Europe. So that would be my answer to that question. There are some parallels. It's just maybe not what we would first think. It's not nationalism. Is that the Ukrainians are, my God, they're heroic. They're nationalists. But I think Zelensky would be the first to say, I need weapons. That's what Ho Chi Minh was saying to the Chinese. He was begging for weapons. Put yourself in his position. I can understand. I'd do the same thing.
Okay. Well, Chris, thank you very much. Appreciate you, going over time and giving such a rich and clear presentation. We'll have to have you back to talk exclusively about the Ukraine and other parallels. So I hope everyone can join me giving Chris a virtual round of applause.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter, Sarah, and everybody. Fantastic.